So whenever you unlock your phone with your fingerprint, or you take pictures, and then Apple goes and analyzes these pictures, running facial recognition, deep neural network software on it, and then suggests to you these custom-made photo galleries, like here, for example, with my niece and my nephew. This means that my and their biometric data has been collected. But how much do we really care about our biometric data? This is the question I'm trying to answer today with my guest Matthew Kugler, who's joining me from Northwestern University, Pritzker School of Law.
Thank you for having me.
And in this session, we're going to talk about his recent working paper, From Identification to Identity, Public Perceptions of Biometric Privacy Harms. So let's jump right in. So Matthew, I'm really excited to have you here with us today from Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law. You're an assistant professor there. Maybe give us some background on how you came to study this subject.
So my original background was in psychology, and when I was moving more into law, what I kept finding were areas where legal scholars weren't sure what people were thinking and feeling, and were having to make guesses about it. Now, if an area of law has been around for a long time, those guesses are pretty good. But in the case of emerging technologies, it's really hard to know how people feel about something if it's only been around for a couple of years. And particularly as I moved into privacy law, there were lots of areas where you're setting legal policy about something that doesn't even exist yet. And the thought is that in the next 5 or 10 years, it's going to be a really big deal to know how people feel about something like biometric privacy. But at the moment, people don't have experience with it. There isn't a lot of objective data about how people are going to feel. So I saw this as a place where some understanding of psychology and some reference to real-world survey data could really help the legal conversation.
So before we jump into the paper, From Identification to Identity, Public Perceptions of Biometric Privacy Harms, let's get some clarity on the terms, I would say. And so when I started reading this, I asked myself, what exactly does he mean by biometric data? And you mentioned in the paper there are different definitions. Maybe walk us a little bit through the different definitions and how you understand it in the context of this paper.
So biometric could just mean measurement of your body in some way. And that could be a very broad term. But we have a whole area of law about genetic privacy. Things like your height and weight aren't super useful for a variety of reasons. So when we talk about biometric privacy and the kinds of possibilities of biometric technology, we generally mean things like your fingerprints, scans of your facial geometry, iris recognition, voice prints, things like that. So we're often in that particular kind of space. And what all these things have in common is that they're usually constant over time. So a scan of your facial geometry now, assuming you're not a baby, is going to still be useful to recognize you in a year. Your fingerprints are going to be constant for almost your entire life. Voices change, but slowly and at predictable times. So all of these things are good long-term identifiers, particularly in ways that something like weight wouldn't be, as you think about the kinds of ways people's weights change over time. And something like your facial structure, you can change it. You can go have surgery and look very different. But that's a very big deal. This isn't like changing your credit card number or something like that.
You bring up this idea in the paper that basically the biometric data is like you having one password for all applications that you can change, and this is what makes this really unique identifiers. Which brings us to the next point. Why should you regulate this?
So there are two different kinds of problems you can have, both of which are related to biometrics being immutable, hard or impossible to change. One is this idea that someone's going to get your thumbprint and hack your bank account with it. That doesn't seem to be a huge possibility. That doesn't seem to be where the major concern is. It's more that you have an identifier that isn't like your student ID number where you have it for a while, then it disappears and no longer matters. It's an identifier that you can give up at one point in time, and then possibly decades later, it can still be used to track you. So you could have your fingerprints taken when you become a US citizen at the age of 18, like you pass the test, your green card transitions into citizenship, you get fingerprinted. Those are just in the system forever. Whereas most numbers in your life change over time. Oh, that used to be my credit card and now no longer is. I used to live there, now I don't. So this hangs around in a way that other things don't. And something like your face is publicly visible. So if you give up your face, which you do basically by walking outside, then that can be used to track you around a store, track you around a city, and you can do any number of very unfortunate things from that. And it's hard to prevent inherently. Like you could wear a mask, and there are some privacy activists who are wearing masks as a way of raising awareness on this issue. A little further than I'm willing to go in my daily life, but there are people who do that.
Yeah.
But to protect your face without legal protection is almost impossible. So that means that if you want to protect faces against facial recognition, you have to turn to law.
No.
You have to say you're not allowed to do it because you can't make it so they can't do it. It's just too easy to get faces. It's, oh, have pictures ever been taken of you and linked to your name? Are they good pictures? If so, they can probably get a reasonable scan of your facial geometry, unless they're not allowed to.
And which brings us to the next point, which is regulation and how is biometric data and privacy of biometric data regulated. And you mentioned in the paper that there are different state regulations, and in particular in Illinois, the BIPA is the most conservative or aggressive regulation. What's so special about BIPA?
So the first thing to understand is that there isn't some American federal regime that protects biometric privacy. This is, by default in the US, unregulated. Now, some states went further. Illinois, entirely by historical accident, has a very strong biometric privacy law. A company can't collect or analyze biometric information without giving very particular disclosures about what it's trying to do and getting very particular kinds of written consent. And importantly, from a kind of legal tactics standpoint, companies wouldn't ever do this by accident. Disclosures were too specific. So lots of companies got caught for just accidentally violating the statute. So that's what's going on in the background. But because they need to give these specific disclosures and get this specific consent, in Illinois, you actually have a lot of protection. And even with these disclosures and with this consent, companies are still not allowed to profit from biometrics, which completely shuts down some business models for facial recognition databases, for instance. But that's Illinois. Only 3 other states even have biometric privacy laws. 2 of those states have very weak enforcement regimes that, to my knowledge, have never been used. That's Washington and Texas. And California's law doesn't actually come online until January 1st, 2020. Mm-hmm. And we don't really know how that's going to go. It's a very broad consumer privacy law. It was passed very quickly. They were amending it as of last month. And it's hard to know whether on January 2nd they're going to look at this law and say, actually, we have to rethink some things. So that's an open question. The problem as I look at these laws is that even in Illinois, where you have a lot of protection, it's all protection against private companies. And the Illinois law specifically exempts the government. So if you look at something like what China has been doing with facial recognition cameras, the Chinese government owns the cameras, it directly gets the footage, it has the facial recognition algorithms, and it can do with this whatever it wants. And what it often seems to want to do is punish people for violating minor laws, which, I mean, those are laws, and jaywalking is bad, that's why we prohibit it. Or to identify people at protests, which, if you think about how the Chinese government works, is particularly troublesome in their case. It's like, well, can we do that in the United States? Currently, there aren't really laws against it. We don't quite have that technology. We didn't have the same incentive to develop it, but the Chinese would be happy to sell it to us. They recently sold some of it to Brazil, and Brazil deployed it last year during Carnival. managed to serve some warrants doing that, just by detecting people with outstanding warrants in crowds.
Ah, okay.
It's like,
I didn't know about
it's a big choice.
that.
There could be real consequences to living in a world where this becomes routine. And one thing I've been trying to figure out is, how do we now make the decisions that will either allow that world to come to be or prevent it? Because it's really hard to tell people, yes, imagine a world where there's a camera on every street corner that's linked to a facial recognition database such that we can track you as you leave your house in the morning and go to work, as you leave work and go to the bar or to the gym, et cetera, as you go back to your front door. That's a big world shift. And it's hard to know how you'd feel living in that world. It's hard to know how you'd act differently living in that world. So I was mostly interested in how people felt about the smaller jumps, because those are happening now, happening next year. But in the back of my mind is the fact that we could easily end up in a world with that big jump.
So when I talk to people about privacy concerns, often what comes up is that they're worried about, like, the Facebook, Amazon, that they're being surveilled by private companies. And what I found interesting is that you mentioned that in the passing of the BIPA in Illinois, there was actually not a lot of lobbying going on from big tech. And that was surprising to me. And obviously, this has shifted now. And you mentioned one example of this really popular arts app by Google, which I think was really trending the beginning of this year, where you could basically take a picture of your face, and then it would suggest like a similar artwork. And it was basically, if you had an IP from Illinois, you were basically excluded from using that app. So what's your thinking around big tech and BIPA?
Big tech made a mistake, fundamentally. So BIPA was passed in 2008. It was passed very quickly. Basically, there was a company that had done business in Illinois going bankrupt. It had a lot of biometric information, particularly fingerprints of Illinois residents. The concern was that this information would be sold as part of the bankruptcy to raise money for the creditors. The judge in that case actually said, no, we're not going to allow this, but the possibility was enough to scare people. And there was a staffer at the ACLU who saw this and said there should be a law. We should pass a law to protect this kind of information. He had little difficulty lining up a couple of sponsors, and there was no real organized opposition to it because Facebook wasn't really in this game yet. Google wasn't really in this game yet. It was one state legislature out of 50, and the only people who were really concerned were state and local government and banks. Banks that had begun to use biometrics, state and local government, who said, we couldn't comply with this if we tried. We collect fingerprints from far too many people. This is just too hard. So they wrote in nice exceptions for government and for banks and for a couple other very well-defined groups. And suddenly this law passed by unanimous consent. And now Facebook is getting sued for billions of dollars because it didn't know at the time that this was a thing they were going to want to do and that Illinois could possibly prohibit. So starting after these lawsuits began to be filed in 2014, now big tech has views about this. First Facebook and then Google have tried to amend this Illinois law. Efforts to pass similar laws in other states are very fiercely fought, but at the time they just didn't realize where this could go. So I think that's why BIPA looks the way it does.
Yeah, that's interesting. So now let's jump into the major contribution of your work here. So you run 2 nationally representative surveys. So let's talk about the first survey, which is basically asking about 3 different scenarios, where on the one hand you have a coffee shop which either collects your biometric information or has a password or ID card. Then it has you have an employment scenario, and lastly, I think you have a gym scenario.
So because Illinois has this one law, there have been a lot of lawsuits filed which are all about biometric check-in procedures. And the idea is that rather than having an ID card, you check in with a thumbprint, or you check in with facial recognition. This is great for companies because they know that you're actually you and you didn't give your ID card to a friend. So if you're a gym, you want people to not be able to share membership cards because you lose money if they do. If you're an employer, you don't want people's buddies to check them in at the beginning of the day. So I looked at this and said, I think this matters. I think people are actually probably going to be upset if these procedures work by biometrics rather than ID cards. But there's an argument that they won't be. You could just say, well, I can't forget my thumbprint. That's actually better than an ID card. And maybe it bothers me that a gym knows, like, okay, I went 3 times last week, only 1 time the week before, or that my coffee shop knows exactly what I order and exactly how many times I've come in. Maybe these kinds of tracking programs themselves are a problem, and the mechanism by which I check in isn't important. So you have these conflicting intuitions. It could be that biometrics matter, or it could be that they don't, or it could even be that they matter and people like them. And for some of these lawsuits, it was important to be able to say whether or not the collection of biometric information was a harm. So you could have a law saying, hey, you're not allowed to do something, but if no one's actually being hurt by you doing it, it's hard to sustain a lawsuit. So what I did in these scenarios is I said, here's an everyday kind of thing, like a coffee shop where there's a loyalty program where you get every 10th coffee free. And how do they know how many coffees you've had? Well, you swipe a card. And you swipe this card and they know what you ordered, they know when you came in, they can do what they want with that information. So how comfortable are you with that procedure? And then other people in the sample got the same description, except instead of swiping the card, it was biometric information. You had either facial recognition or thumbprints, which are 2 things that did exist in the world. There were places that checked in this way. And then there was a further elaboration. This data was either free for them to use however they wanted, or they had to use it only for this one purpose. And that was specific to the biometrics. And what I found is that people were less comfortable if it worked by biometrics. So these same stories about this coffee shop loyalty program, if it was a thumbprint rather than an ID card, people liked it less. And then I said, well, would you want to be part of this loyalty program? Is it worth it to get every 10th coffee free if they're tracking all these things? And if they were using an ID card to do the tracking, 77% wanted to be in the loyalty program. If they were using a fingerprint or facial recognition, 47% wanted to be in the program. And that's a pretty big drop for just going from ID card to something else. Because they're still tracking how often you come in. They're still tracking what you order. It's still actually a giant pile of good marketing information right there. But the mere fact of adding a thumbprint to it or a facial recognition scan to it creeped out 30% of the sample. And the gym case was the same thing, except it was a gym membership. The employment case was just a thumbprint. I didn't do a facial recognition variant for that. And for those 2, I said, would you pay to get out of this system and go to an ID card? And for them, I believe it was like between 30 and 40% said they would actually pay to switch to an ID card. But I like the coffee shop scenario the best because it was closest to how it seemed to actually work in the world. You could imagine a coffee shop saying, hey, yeah, this is our loyalty program. And
True,
yes,
true.
we're working by thumbprints. Isn't that so great? You don't even have to remember a card. God knows we all have enough of those little tags on our keychain to like check in here and get a discount there. It's like, oh,
No, I totally, I asked myself, would I give up a free coffee for them scanning my face? And I mean, I always go to the same coffee shop and they know me. And so every now and then I get a free coffee. And it's basically a human facial recognition. And I personally wouldn't be as worried, but of course, you never know where this data ends up and how it's being used. And suddenly you're being tracked all over. So
that's an important way of thinking about this, because one reaction I get from people is, look, my face isn't private. What are you even talking about? And that's a fair reaction. It's one of the reasons I ran these studies, because I thought people weren't going to feel that way. But it's something I get a lot, particularly from American academics, which is they're skeptical that many things are private, just based on the intuitions developed under American law. So they say, look, I go to places where people recognize me all the time. How is this different? And I think the difference is exactly that if it's an electronic system, you can copy paste. And suddenly the facial recognition scan that was the barista at your coffee shop is now used to track you on public streets, is now being sold to whatever other institution. And that's where the technology comes in. There's a kind of purpose shift and a decline in fallibility.
Mm-hmm.
You can suddenly now walk into, like, say your local coffee shop knows you. Maybe you're okay with that. You're traveling on business. You're in Paris. If they also know you, that's kind of creepy.
Mm-hmm, true.
And I think that's where people have a hang up about this.
True. Okay, so let's talk about the second survey which you ran, which I found quite fascinating, where you basically look at different use cases. One main category is basically if it is used for security purposes, for example, as an identifier in the bank, or if it is used to track if people who've been banned from stores are re-entering these stores versus other use cases. So maybe walk us a little bit through this second survey and what the results were there.
So this paper is about harm. And as you talk through this, there are plenty of people who will say, look, how does it hurt me if? And how does it hurt me if my bank uses my voice print to confirm that I'm really me? And it's kind of hard to answer that question. It sounds pretty good if your bank has yet another way of confirming that you are indeed you and are actually authorizing the transaction you're trying to perform and that you're not in the process of being robbed. That just sounds good. So you stare at cases like that and say, well, actually, I think people would be pretty comfortable with that. But still using my biometrics, which is a thing people are telling me they're not comfortable with, isn't this all going to be very context dependent? So that's one of the things I asked about, and people were decently comfortable with that. People are pretty comfortable, or 70% or more comfortable than not, with using biometrics to unlock their phone. But then I started asking about the fun cases, the technologically ambitious cases, the next generation cases. So you can currently use security cameras to say, is this John, the person who I banned from this store last week for shoplifting? And American stores do this all the time. They'll catch someone shoplifting and they'll make them sign something saying, you are banned for life, please go away. And as a consequence for this, maybe they don't try to prosecute them that time. It's like, look, we caught you, just please never come back. And there are some stores that appear, and they're not always open about this, to try to use facial recognition to enforce that. Because otherwise, they just go to the next store down the line, or they have a book of photos, but there are a lot of photos in the book, so it could get hard. Facial recognition sounds like it's perfectly designed for this kind of thing, and a majority of people were comfortable with that kind of use. But then you go to the next step. You say, look, I want to know who's in the market for washing machines. I want to know who's in the market for a hot tub. This is a durable goods purchase. You don't make it very often. If you bought one last week, you don't want one this week. So what I really want to know is who's been wandering around Home Depot and spending a lot of time in the aisle with washing machines. Well, you can do that. It's a little harder. You need to say that they were in the aisle with washing machines. Then I followed them to the cash register where they checked out with their credit card. And oh yes, this is John Smith. And I have their email address because they wanted their receipt emailed to them. Now I can send them an ad for washing machines. And very few people, or a much smaller number of people, were comfortable with that. I believe it dropped down to about a quarter. So it's the same entity, a store like Home Depot or Lowe's Home Improvement, using the same technology, facial recognition, to either make their store safer and exclude shoplifters, or market to you. And one of these was judged fine by a good majority of the sample, and one of these was judged to be fine by about a quarter of the sample. And I thought that that kind of encapsulated what I was finding here, because it wasn't even just about who was doing it, it was about what they were trying to do with it. And that's a kind of nuance that none of the current state's privacy laws do a particularly good job with. Illinois, somewhat by accident, has this exclusion for banks. They're allowed to do it, and that's probably good, given what banks want to do with biometrics, which is generally make their depositors safer. But there is no exception in BIPA for having a security camera to detect known shoplifters. Maybe there should be. Maybe as you pass the next generation of laws, you'll put that in. Having said that, if you were writing a biometric privacy law that covered governments, a security exception would be extremely dangerous, because suddenly you could still use facial recognition to identify protesters, who are probably breaking at least one law as they're doing it. And the idea of a government being able to scan a crowd and say there were 2,000 people at this protest, and here are all their names, strikes me as very dangerous from what, as an American, I would call a First Amendment perspective. So very dangerous from the ability to speak freely, to advocate for your beliefs, to assemble in public, to protest grievances. That's something where we have to be careful what power we give to governments. And currently, under American law, you can do that in pretty much the entire country. There have been a couple of cities that have been trying to ban the use of facial recognition, but smaller entities can't bind larger entities. So if the city bans it, the state can still do it. If the state bans it, the national government can still do it. And honestly, you're probably most afraid of the national government doing it because no one's watching them. And at the moment, they can. So that's the future I'm concerned about. That gets beyond this paper, which is very much about consumer uses. That's where the action currently is. But looking overseas, government uses, I think, are where this is going. And we have to be concerned about that.
So wrapping up, I thought, what would be the main policy conclusions from this paper? And one thing you mentioned already is to maybe introduce some more carve-out exemptions from these biometric privacy laws, like for the banking vertical or for the shoplifter use case. But maybe there are other aspects that I haven't considered yet. But what would be like your key takeaway from these surveys, and how should it inform policymakers going forward?
So if I could make only 2 points, I would say, one, people care about biometric privacy. This was not obvious. I talked to a lot of scholars that thought this wasn't an important topic, that thought that people don't care about this, that think there's no harm there. People are telling me that there's harm. People are telling me that they would give up benefits to preserve biometric privacy. This is something we should be taking seriously. And two, people care about purpose and context. So the mere fact that you gave up your biometric privacy in one context is not evidence you wouldn't care in another context. So it isn't that my face is private, please don't look at it. That's not what they're trying to say here. They're saying, I don't want you to be able to use facial recognition to track me in the following ways. And I think that's a very reasonable thing for them to say, and it's something that if we want to take it seriously, we'll have to think very carefully about how we do policy.
Makes a lot of sense. So Matthew, thank you so much for being with us here today. We're looking forward to future work on this really important topic, I think, especially from a European perspective. We care a lot about privacy, as you know. So this is really interesting work. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.